the heart of the Galactic Peace Council's towering chamber, where light from 5 suns shone through crystal-paneled ceilings, stood Commander Jace Harlan, a human soldier wrapped in gleaming white armor marked by the blue crest of Earth's defense force. Around him, beings from 100 star systems sat in semicircles, murmuring in low tones. At the center, standing on the council's polished obsidian platform, was Princess Valera of the Azari Dominion, only 19 but already infamous for her sharp tongue and sharper pride, with silver tattoos curling across her violet skin and her golden robe flowing behind her like a royal comet. She stepped forward with the poise of someone born to be obeyed. "Is this humanity's finest?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with mockery. The room grew quieter as she circled Jace like a predator studying a weaker animal. "All metal and no spirit," she added. "I expected more from the race that begged for a seat at our table." Some delegates chuckled. Others hid their unease. Case stood still, his expression unreadable behind his helmet. Slowly, he reached up and unsealed the clasps on his armor. The chamber watched in silence as he removed each piece: shoulder guards, chest plate, leg braces, till he stood in his simple Earth uniform, a plain gray jacket with black trousers. He looked far less like a warrior now, and more like a man who had seen too much to be impressed by ceremony. "I never needed the armor," he said, his voice steady, neither proud nor bitter. "I wore it because I thought you'd only listen to someone who looked the part. I was wrong." He glanced around, eyes meeting those of alien leaders, scholars, and warriors. "I came here to offer peace, but maybe you're not ready for that." With that, he turned his back to the entire council and walked slowly toward the exit, the echo of his footsteps the only sound in the vast hall. No one stopped him. Even Princess Valera, who had expected to humiliate a soldier, now stood still, the smirk fading from her face as whispers broke out across the room. Some called it weakness, others called it strength. The footage of his departure was already being transmitted across hundreds of systems. The words he spoke were being quoted in every known language. Jace didn't look back. He didn't flinch. Outside the chamber, beneath the twin moons of Halcerin Prime, he stepped into a shuttle and disappeared into the stars. But inside the council, his absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. And for the first time in her life, Valera felt something unfamiliar twist. Inside her dash uncertainty, the news of the human soldier who walked out of the Galactic Peace Council without his armor spread faster than any official message ever had by morning. Across 1,000 worlds, everyone was talking about Commander Jace Harlan, as a man who had been mocked by a princess and had answered not with anger, but silence and dignity. Holoscreens on trade stations replayed the moment he removed his armor. And political forums buzzed with divided opinions. Some said it was a display of weakness, that humans were too soft for the galaxy's harsh realities, while others claimed it was the strongest thing anyone had seen in years. And somewhere in the center of all this attention was Princess Valera, so proud of her sharp words, now sitting in the quiet chambers of her royal cruiser with her hands folded tightly, and her thoughts circling the memory of the human's quiet eyes. She hadn't expected this reaction, hadn't thought the galaxy would care so much about one man's silent protest. But the way he left us, if the council wasn't worth fighting with, had unsettled something inside her. She tried to push the thought away, reminding herself that the Azari Dominion had been the center of power for 1,000 years, that humans were newcomers still crawling out of their gravity wells. Yet the image of Jace's back as he walked away would not leave her mind. The council itself had grown tense since his departure, with Earth's ambassadors refusing to speak, choosing instead to pull back their delegations quietly, leaving empty chairs and growing silence at meetings once full of noise and ambition. Valera began to notice that her name, once followed by praise. Kenny sparked uncomfortable looks and whispers others thought she had gone too far. Not because she insulted a soldier, but because she had failed to see the soul behind the armor. The heart that refused to be measured by technology or titles. Curious and frustrated, she sent a private message to the Earth Alliance, asking where Commander Harlan had gone. But received no reply. He had vanished, not just politically, but completely. No records, no signal trails, nothing, as if the stars themselves had swallowed him. The mystery only deepened when traders from the outer systems claimed they had seen a human helping rebuild refugee settlements on the edge of known space, where war and time had left only ruins. No one could confirm it, but the story added to the legend. And Valera couldn't help but wonder if he had gone there to prove a point or simply to escape. The more she thought about it, the more restless she became. If he had run, then she had won, hadn't she? But if he hadn't run, if he had gone to make a difference while she remained in marble halls surrounded by protocol and pride, what did that make her? One night, unable to sleep, she stood on the deck of her ship, staring out at the stars, and made a decision she would find him, not out of guilt, not to apologize, but because she needed to know what made a man like Jace Harlan walk away from the highest seat of power and never look back. If she could understand that, maybe she could understand something about herself too. And so she prepared her ship for deep space travel, deactivating royal escorts and sending false reports to her advisors, saying she was visiting a nearby moon for diplomatic reasons. In truth, she followed the only clue she had: a distant settlement report from a neutral trader who had seen a human without armor digging water lines on a desert planet called Darrow 7, forgotten by most maps and known only to those who had no place else to go. As the ship jumped into hyperspace, Valera sat alone in the pilot seat, eyes fixed ahead, unsure of what she would find. But certain of one thing: this was no longer about pride or diplomacy or proving humans wrong. Something about that quiet man had shifted the balance of the galaxy, and if there was even a chance that he could do it again, she had to see it with her own eyes. The desert world of Darrow 7 spun slowly under a dull red sun, its surface covered in endless sand and cracked stone, with wind that howled like distant voices and skies filled with dust instead of stars. And as Princess Valera's sleek silver shuttle descended through the thick atmosphere, she stared out the window, unsure what she would find on a planet forgotten by time and maps. The coordinates she had received led her to a scattered group of shelters near a dried-out canyon. Nothing like the royal cities of the Azari or the glittering spaceports of the Council. Worlds these were rough metal domes, patched with old ship parts and solar panels, built not for beauty but survival. And the moment her ship landed, the dust rose up around it like a living thing, scratching at the hull and blinding her view. Kia, she stepped out, alone, wearing a desert cloak over her royal robes, and the heat struck her like a wall, dry and sharp, making it hard to breathe. But she pressed forward, ignoring the curious eyes of the settlers who had stopped what they were doing to watch her approach. She asked no questions at first, only walked until she found him, Jace Harlan, the human who had walked out of the council chamber without a word of anger or defense, now standing at the edge of a broken pipeline, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in oil, working beside a young alien boy to restore the water system for the camp. He didn't look surprised to see her, only nodded once as she stopped in front of him, his expression calm, neither cold nor welcoming. "You followed me?" he said simply. And she opened her mouth to reply, but couldn't find the right words, 'cause nothing about this place matched her expectations. She had imagined him hiding in some quiet cave, sulking in silence. But instead, he was here, building something real with people who had no home, no flags, no power, just hope. She finally spoke, her voice dry, saying she came to see if he was still pretending to be noble without armor. but the words sounded weak, even to her ears, and he only looked at her for a moment before going back to his work. Confused and unable to walk away, she stayed, helping where she could, carrying tools, fetching water, even sitting with the children at night under the low lights of solar lamps, listening to their stories of worlds lost and lives shattered by wars the council barely remembered. Over the days, she watched Jace more closely, not as a soldier or a symbol, but as a person who worked without rest, who never raised his voice, and who never asked for praise. One morning, a sandstorm rolled in fast, earlier than expected, and panic spread through the camp as people scrambled to secure shelters and protect supplies. And in the middle of the chaos, Valera felt herself pulled into the storm, struck by flying debris and thrown against a metal wall as the world turned to noise and dust. Darkness followed, and when she awoke, hours later, her body aching and her throat dry, she found herself inside one of the small medical tents, with Jace sitting beside her, wiping dust from her face with a damp cloth. "You should have stayed on your throne," he said softly, but there was no anger in his voice, only tired concern. She didn't answer, just stared at the man who had every reason to hate her, but it still carried her through a storm. And in that silence, something shifted inside her, something heavier than pride and older than titles. She saw the truth she had missed before, not just in him, but in the people here, and for the first time in her life. She wondered if power meant nothing without purpose. Outside, the storm began to fade, and the camp slowly came back to life. But inside that small shelter, a princess and a soldier sat without speaking, surrounded by sand and silence, and the distance between their worlds seemed just a little smaller. The storm did not come with a warning, no flicker in the skies, no distant thunder, just a sudden, heavy shift in the wind that made the sands rise like a beast awakening from sleep. And in the camp on Darrow 7, where survivors of old wars had worked for weeks to build a fragile new life, fear spread faster than fire. Jace Harlan, who had been repairing the power relay near the canyon wall, today, first a deep pulse in the ground, followed by a rushing sound like 1,000 whispers. He stood up at once, scanning the horizon, and saw it coming, a wall of red and gold moving too fast to escape. Around him, the others noticed two voices rising in alarm, and within seconds, he was shouting orders, pointing people toward the shelters they had built from scrap and patience, telling them to grab the children, to cover the panels, to seal the water tanks. There was no time to be gentle. The storm would not wait. Princess Valera, who had just started to understand this place, found herself frozen for half a second as the wind struck, pulling at her cloak and blinding her with sand. "Ed," and then Jace's voice broke through it all clear, strong, direct, telling her to help the West group reach shelter. Without thinking, she obeyed, running toward the group of frightened beings near the edge of the camp, helping a limping, wrinkly elder and two children who were too small to fight the wind on their own. The sky darkened fast, the sun vanishing behind clouds of sand, and the temperature dropped as the storm swallowed everything inside the shelters. People huddled together, but outside, the storm tore at the metal walls, rattled the supports, screamed through every crack. Jace was still outside, checking the far line where 3 solar towers had begun to lean dangerously. Their supports weakened from last week's quake, and though others begged him to come inside, he refused. Those towers powered the water purification system, and if they fell, the camp would lose more than light. Struggling against the wind, he reached the base of the nearest tower and began tying emergency supports, sand cutting into his skin and eyes burning, while above him the sky flashed with strange light, electric arcs dancing in the storm like ghosts. Valera, inside now with the others, kept glancing at the door, her heart pounding, and though no one asked, she knew they all wondered the same thing: would Jace make it back? Finally, unable to sit still, she grabbed a spare mask and stepped outside again, forcing her way into the wind, calling his name. Searching through the storm until she saw his shape through the swirling sand, bent over, tying the last cable. She reached him, shouting over the wind that it was enough that the towers would stand, but he only looked at her, eyes calm, and said, "Help me with the last line." And though every instinct told her to run, she helped, her hands trembling, as they tied the last support and began the long, slow walk back toward the shelters, shielding their faces and guiding each other step by step. Halfway there, a piece of metal flew loose and struck Valera's leg, cutting deep and knocking her down. Pain flared, sharp and sudden, but before she could even cry out, Jace was lifting her, supporting her weight as they stumbled through the final stretch, until at last the door opened and hands pulled them inside. Warmth, light, and voices surrounded them, and then the door slammed shut, cutting off the storm's roar. Valera collapsed, her leg bleeding, breath shallow, and Jace lowered her onto a cot as the medics worked quickly, their tools humming quietly. Time passed strangely after that, long hours in a blur of noise and sleep, of people tending wounds, of children whispering in the corners, of power flickering but never failing, thanks to the towers they had saved. When she woke fully, it was quiet, the storm gone, only fine dust in the air and soft sunlight seeping through the roof panels. Kay sat beside her, silent, watching the others rebuild, and she turned to him slowly, Kay, her voice hoarse, and asked, "Why did you stay outside?" He answered, after a moment, "'Cause they needed someone to believe it was still possible to hold the line." And she said nothing, because deep down she understood. Outside, the camp had survived. The shelters were still standing, the water still clean, the power still flowing in the days that followed. The people grew closer, stronger, bound by the memory of what they had faced together. Valera found herself sitting with the children again, helping repair broken panels, even learning how to adjust the wind sensors. No longer a visitor, not quite one of them, but no longer apart. Jace never spoke much about the council or why he left, but one evening, as they watched the twin moons rise over the canyon, she asked quietly, "Do you miss it? The power, the title, the armor?" He thought for a long time before answering, "Sometimes, but not what it made me." She understood more than she wanted to admit, and as the stars appeared above them, she knew her mission had changed. She had come to find a man she thought she could shame, but had instead found a truth she could not ignore. That strength wasn't about control or piety, was about standing in the storm, even when no one else would. The days after the storm passed slowly, but never quietly, filled with the sound of repair tools, quiet conversations, and the wind that never stopped whispering across the dunes of Darrow 7, as if the planet itself was trying to speak. Princess Valera, still limping slightly from the wound on her leg, refused to sit idle. And though the settlers often gave her respectful space, they no longer looked at her as only royalty. They now saw her as someone who had stood in the storm and bled beside them. And that quiet shift meant more than the titles she had once worn like armor. She spent her mornings walking the edge of the canyon, helping check the tower supports, testing the solar panels, and learning from Jace how each part of the settlement worked together like a fragile machine, held not by command, but by care. He never lectured, never raised his voice, only showed by doing, fixing a loose cable here, lifting a beam there, sharing food with children too shy to ask until even the smallest among them followed his example. Valera watched all of this with a strange mix of pride and frustration, because back on her homeworld, words were weapons and power meant making others obey. But here, it meant showing up even when no one was watching. And that truth unsettled her more than any political threat ever had. One afternoon, a small group of nomads arrived at the edge of the camp. Tall, thin beings with copper-colored skin and long cloaks made from threadbare sailcloth. They had traveled across the desert after hearing rumors of clean water and working shelters, and though cautious at first, they were welcomed without hesitation by Jace, who offered food and medical care as if it cost him nothing. Valera was surprised by how easily the newcomers were accepted, how no one asked what they could offer in return. And when she questioned Jace about it, he said simply, "Out here, survival is the only status that matters." Later that night, she sat by the central fire pit, listening as an old nomad told stories of the deep desert of winds that could tear memories from the mind, and dust storms that sang the names of the forgotten land. Though the tales were strange, they felt real in the silence of the dunes, under stars that stretched like silver rivers across the sky. The next morning, something changed. A message came through a damaged satellite relay. Scrambled, but clear enough. The council was looking for her, sending ships to nearby systems, not because she was in danger, but because her absence had become too loud to ignore. Her advisors demanded answers, and there were whispers of betrayal, of political scandal, of the Azari losing control of one of their brightest leaders. Valera stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without a word, but Jace had already seen her face tighten with worry, and later he asked, "You'll have to decide soon where you belong." And though she didn't reply, the question sat with her like a stone in her chest. She knew the truth. The council wanted her back, not because they missed her, but because they feared the symbol she might become if she stayed with a man like Jace on a world like this, among people who had no seats in high chambers, but who had learned how to live without being ruled. As the sun rose on her 6th week in the settlement, another sandstorm began forming on the horizon, smaller than the last but fast-moving. And this time, the settlers knew what to do. There was no panic, no shouting, only calm preparation. And Valera helped lead the effort, directing children to safety, helping secure the towers, remembering every lesson she had learned from Jace without needing him to say a word. When the storm hit, it came with more force than expected, and the northwest shelter began to collapse. Valera ran toward it without thinking, crawling through the wind to reach 2 trapped workers, lifting a metal beam with pure will and pain pulsing through her leg. And when she pulled the last worker to safety, the crowd watching her cheered, not out of duty, but out of real gratitude. When the storm passed, the settlement still stood, stronger than before, and Valera, covered in dust and bruises, sat beside Jace again, breathing hard, but smiling for the first time in days. "You belong here," he said quietly, and she looked at him with tired eyes and asked, "Do you?" He paused, then said, "I didn't, at first, but I earned it," and that answer stayed with her long into the night. The next morning, a new ship arrived at council, but a small merchant vessel carrying fresh supplies and news from other systems. And on the last page of the data scroll was a headline, "Alien Princess Missing Rumors of Human Influence Grow." Valera didn't laugh, but there was a trace of amusement in her voice when she handed it to Jace, who only raised an eyebrow and said, "They still don't understand, do they?" She shook her head, whispering, "No, but maybe that's their lesson to learn." And for the first time, she felt something deeper than pride, something like purpose. The lesson of dust was not in how it burned the skin or blinded the eyes, but in how it revealed what stayed standing after the storm passed. And here on Darrow 7, among survivors and builders, she had seen what the council could never understand. That true strength came not from crowns or weapons or even speeches, but from being the one who stayed when the skies turned dark, the one who lifted others, not for gain, but because it had to be done. The stars above Darrow 7 shone brighter than ever before, sharp and clear in the cool night sky, and while most of the camp slept in peace, Jace Harlan stood alone on the edge of the cliff that overlooked the dark desert, listening to the soft wind that always carried a trace of dust and memory. Below him, the settlement flickered with quiet lights, Solar panels humming gently, shelters holding strong, children dreaming without fear. He had built all of this not alone, but with people who had nothing left to lose. And now they had something worth protecting, something real. Behind him, footsteps approached softly and stopped. Ken, and he didn't have to turn to know it was Valeria. Her presence was steady now, calm and sure, no longer the pre-trapped royal he had first met, but someone changed by fire, by dust, and by choice. They sent another ship, she said, voice low. Council scouts, just on the edge of the system, not landing yet, but watching Chase. Didn't move, only asked how long until they decide to act. And she answered, not long. Think they're waiting to see if I'll return quietly along. Silence followed, broken only by the wind and the faint hum of the camp below, until Jace turned slightly and asked, will you? Valera hesitated, then stepped beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, and said, I thought I would. At first, but now I'm not sure I should. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with something deeper, a conflict between duty and truth. And Jace understood it better than anyone, because he had once faced the same choice and walked away from everything. The council would not forget this. They would not forgive it, either, not just the princess leaving, but the symbol she had become, a bridge between power and people, between what was built and what was real. In the following days, more ships arrived. Not from the council, but from nearby systems, small transports, private freighters, even a few old warships now turned civilian. Each bringing settlers, volunteers, healers, and engineers, people who had heard of the camp on Darrow 7, where humans and aliens lived side by side without fear or rank, and where storms were faced together, not alone. The camp grew quickly, expanding beyond the original shelters, with new buildings made from stone and solar concrete, new farms starting on the canyon floor with imported soil, and schools built not for tradition, but for learning the skills of survival and unity. Jace walked among the new faces each day, teaching, helping, always watching for the signs of what would come next, because peace this strong never went unnoticed. Valera stayed close, not as a ruler, but as one of them, Kit, giving her knowledge freely, using her voice not to command, but to ask, to understand. And people began to follow her not because of who she was, but because of what she had become. One morning, a council warship entered orbit, its massive shadow drifting over the camp like a silent threat. And for the first time, fear crept back into the eyes of the settlers. Memories of old wars returned. Memories of orders given from ships that never set foot on the ground. But Jace stepped forward, along with Valera, and sent a message directly to the vessel. We are not rebels. We are builders. If you come to talk, we will listen. If you come to take, you will find nothing left to steal. Hours passed without reply, the ship hovering silently, its weapons cold but ready, until finally a smaller shuttle descended. Soldiers, but a single diplomat, council-born, dressed in sharp robes and cold eyes, stepping into the camp with the weight of empire behind him. He looked at the people, at the structures, at the mix of species and languages, and he frowned, as if offended by their very existence. Then turned to Valera and said, this cannot continue. You are Azari, a princess, and this is chaos. She didn't answer at first, only stared at him, then asked quietly, is it chaos, or is it peace you can't control? He shifted, uncomfortable, but didn't reply, and she added, look around. No flags, no armies, just people helping each other. Isn't that what the council claims to protect? He tried to argue, to speak of law and unity, of order and loyalty. But the words fell flat on the red dust of Darrow 7. And in the silence that followed, Jace stepped forward and said, We don't need your permission to survive. The diplomat left that evening, saying nothing more. And the warship stayed for 3 more days, watching, until it too vanished into the stars. The message was clear. The council didn't know what to do with them. They hadn't fought a war, hadn't declared rebellion, hadn't broken any law directly, and yet they had created something dangerous, an idea. A quiet revolution where power belonged to those who earned trust, not those born to it. Word spread faster now, and from the far edges of known space. Messages arrived, some of hope, others of warning, but all signs that the quiet spark on Darrow 7 had become something more. And through it all, Jace and Valera stood side by side. Not as lovers, not as rulers, but as leaders, by example. And in their silence, in their work, in the dust and wind and stars, humanity's quiet revolution marched forward, not with flags, but with footsteps, one honest act at a time.